All aboard the Limbus Company book tour, the one right in the city where we get into nitty-gritty of every canto and its literary inspirations, with a significant delay, because your guide is a very slow reader and an even slower thinker. Not to mention the scripts are all disjointed messes. If this is your first time on our tour, please find records of our previous excursions in the video description. Speaking of past travels, a lot of you voiced concern regarding how we map each stop on our journey to Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, in that we skipped over greed due to it not being considered a sin in the city, and assigned the whaling trip to fall under wrath. There were some voices that since gloom replaced greed, we should think of that chapter in the context of that sin. And in response, I would like to guide you all to how Canto V is described in the cutscene theater of the game. Amidst the conflict that knew no end, we set sail on the great lake, into its ineffable waves, into the flames of a certain wrath. Of course, the writing in the game we're discussing is not so simple as to focus on a single emotion at a time to the detriment of anything else, not to mention how the statuses that fit each scene can be a theme for the chapter but not fit to the structure of the Divine Comedy. But this description combined with how later cantos shake out makes me dead certain we're on the right path when it comes to mapping onto the literary Inferno. Please trust your humble guide. I may not know how mirrors work, but I am an all-powerful wizard. Anyway, let's get back to our tour. Before we get back to retracing Dante's steps that are following another Dante's steps, we need to make two short stops. Starting with one fitting this festive season, or at least it would be if I released this video back in December. You all know what the modern day myth of Santa Claus and his little elves is, so we're not really gonna spend a lot of time here. Honestly, even on a replay, this Intervallo is easily the weakest link in the whole game for me. On one hand, it's a needed exploration of some concepts for Limbus onlys, about the outskirts, that there are more intelligent species than just humans out there, all of whom hate humanity with a passion, and that there are people stuck outside of the city, surviving an existence that is somehow even harder than whatever the hell is happening inside of that sprawl on a daily basis. And these are pretty important things to establish, especially as we know that knowledge pays off later down the line, with some cynic bird watching. But as presented in the Intervallo, it's kind of a whole lot of nothing. The gnomes and Santata are a dark spin on a cheerful thing from real life, but they don't really give us anything we wouldn't know about the outskirts from previous games in the series. Crayon and Domino are pretty flat as characters too, to the point where I completely forgot their names until now. We get glimpses of how anxious Heathcliff is about his upcoming visit to the Wuthering Heights, Don Quixote's protectiveness for children, some nods to Sinclair growing past his Christmas-related trauma. Oh yeah, and the title of the Intervallo is probably a reference to Miracle on 34th Street, but the link is really just Santa being there and the number in the title. At least it's a movie that is popular enough internationally to warrant that guess. Overall, not much to discuss on this trip, so let's move on. Another Intervallo brings a bit more excitement as we get into the middle of a gang turf war in the backstreets of T-Corp. On one side, antagonistic to our efforts, are the Kurokumo clan, based on the Yakuza, their skin covered in tattoos of black clouds, after which their clan is named. As cool as they are visually, there's not much to dig into here, though I do wish we got one of them ripping off their shirt to show a full back tattoo with something else, because every time it happens, it's rad as fuck. For now, they're only of importance because they already had a presence when the Blade lineage showed up out of the blue. The lineage is where we get a bit more to bite into. In the original Korean, they are called Kyongshim, which is a name attributed to organized groups of criminals during the Korean pre-colonial era, with records mentioning them going back to the 17th century. The members of the organization were rumored to be skilled in martial arts and were linked to stuff like assassinations and acts of terror. They are very similar to what you would expect out of other criminal organizations like the Cosa Nostra. A lot of disenfranchised young people, a certain sense of allure born out of their secrecy, and a whole lot of symbols, rituals and traditions I'm not gonna relate here because my one source is a NamuWiki article tortured with machine translation tools. The Blade lineage are, in a way, a mirror to the Kurokumo, except historically the Yakuza managed to rise to prominence and infamy by embedding themselves into proper society and larger businesses, just like the Kurokumo has a big brother watching over them in the form of the Thumb, and I never heard of Kyongshim before researching this video. The Progmon Blades are therefore painted as an organization in decline. Exiles, a syndicate held together by ties of loyalty that run away from their nest, modeled after the agrarian pre-colonial Korea. In this instance also mentioned to be plagued by rampant corruption, which also was a problem in the real-life country, leading them into the library, which then spat them out in the worst place they could find themselves in. Their leader and mentor is named Bamboo-Hatted Kim, and he is once again a reference lost in translation. In Korean, the name is pronounced Kim Sakkat, and it is also a moniker of Kim Byung-yeon, a traveling 19th century poet. Guy just set out at the age of 20, traveled across the country, and wrote impromptu poetry. Goals as fuck. A lot of his work mocked authority, and as such he was known as the people's poet. And some of it was really crude, playing with double meaning depending on whether the characters were understood to be read as Korean or Chinese, as they were written in Hanja, so using the Chinese characters to convey the Korean language. If there is any such wordplay in Limbus, I can't say it for obvious reasons. This Kim is also a wanderer, identified by his bamboo hat, and a stereotypical warrior poet. Though I suppose some of this poetic clown shit is shown in his signature move that is the namesake of this Intervallo: yield my flesh to claim their bones. Even in Library of Ruina, where he first appears as a storyless general reception fight, the notion of that attack goes against all the instincts you have. What do you mean I should eat this attack rather than try to clash it because he gets an incredibly busted follow-up? What do you mean he actually wants to lose to you at first? And in Limbus' case, what do you mean he actually wants his SP to be as low as possible? And so, the two-faced poetry of yesteryear haunts us in a video game today. Clever little bastard. Aside from the lineage, we also get Dante's head burning hot and them giving us snippets of lore on how the light works, obscured by a bajillion sensor boxes. All it really tells us is that people who turn into Pekatula are those without an internal image of themselves when distorting, seeing themselves as a part of the crowd, and as such not bringing forth their distorted image of self, but once again becoming one of many. This also fits the first description we get of experiencing the transformation back in Leviathan, as a depersonalization, losing yourself and becoming painted over by one of your many sins. I guess in a way this also explains Cromer and Dongrang's Pekatulum-like but still individualized forms. Cromer saw herself as a member of Nagel und Hammer first and foremost, and Dongrang's first steps down the spiral are due to seeing himself as a nobody when compared to his peers in the League. Dante also mentions how resisting the distortion brings forth ego, I think for the first time just saying that outright for Limbus onlys. Thanks, Clockhead! We also get a glimpse of the larger Limbus Company structure, with the after team showing up, a very nice lady chatting with us on the radio, and a whole operation to retrieve the monolith that accelerated Kim's distortion. All of these things tie back to Distortion Detective. The after team operatives are clearly reminiscent of Woodjat, a private army at the employ of a certain lady called Diaz, and the Canto IX ID for Otis just dispelled any notion that the two organizations are not one and the same. Diaz has her fingers in a lot of pies, including instigating the smoke war on behalf of Ian and Benjamin, and it seems that she is bankrolling Limbus as well, which explains why they never have to worry about their budget. Udjat is another name for the Eye of Horus, represented on their masks, which is a common motif on ancient Egyptian amulets and whatnot, symbolizing healing and restoration, cause Horus got his eye eaten by Set, but later got it back. Very interesting how an organization we've seen do nothing but strike force shit is using a symbol of healing to identify themselves. The chatty operator on the radio is Ezra, who was a child soldier at that organization as well. And a black box, or a monolith, are weird artifacts supposedly coming from the territories of the fallen L-Corp that can cause mass distortion, but not much more is known about them at this point. Also, let me just add that Kaivan said nothing wrong and I am kicking up my feet waiting for her to appear again. Let's go visit the Manor of Wuthering Heights. The literary Dante and Virgil disembark from their trip atop the river Styx to arrive at the gates of City of Dis, the sixth circle of hell, the one where heretics lie in fiery tombs. And in the city, Limbus Company arrives at the gates to Wuthering Heights, where Katherine Earnshaw lies within a coffin shining with bright light, awaiting her own funeral. Though of course this is a bit more complex than it seems. The novel Wuthering Heights by Emily Jane Bronte was released in 1847 to initially little acclaim, only to become a part of the English literary canon much later. much too late for the author to learn of the impact she made worldwide, as she died a year after its publication, at the age of 30. After reading the book, I can definitely see why it was so polarizing. It has undeniably beautiful prose describing some of the cattiest, most loathsome people imaginable. I suppose the Victorian Brits did not appreciate a story about a romance that is tragic not due to circumstance, but because everyone involved made it infinitely worse. If you were to summarize the story in a single sentence, it would be that even the worst people you know are capable of love. And while it ends on a positive note, one of children not repeating the sins of their parents, I can only imagine how much of a slap this book's portrayal of wealth, nobility and racial prejudice was to its Victorian audience. With the Limbus portrayal, there are a few key differences when compared to the book. Most notably, the framing and time span. In the original Wuthering Heights, we arrive at the location near the end of the tale, following one Mr. Lockwood, who is looking to rent the property of Rushwood Grange from its owner, Heathcliff. Only after meeting his new landlord does he find journal entries belonging to one Katherine Earnshaw, and, intrigued, learns of the history of the place from Nellie, a servant at the manor, reaching back 30 years into the past, when Heathcliff was first brought into Wuthering Heights. While Limbus does not have a Mr. Lockwood of its own, it does retain this indirect framing in a way. What we are told about Cathy we receive in recollections, supernatural journal entries and speculation. Just as with the original novel, who says what and why is just as important as the story told. The much bigger difference is that while the book's events cover two whole generations of people, not just Heathcliff, Katherine, Edgar and Hindley, but also their respective children, Limbus is set at roughly the midpoint of the novel, with Heathcliff returning after a few years to the manor a changed man. As such, all the second generation characters are not present physically, but their traits are instead transplanted into the characters meant to be inspired by the first generation of these messy bitches. We will discuss how that works in detail for each character. First, let's tackle the things in this canto unrelated to the novel. As mentioned before, the part of divine comedy that this canto would map onto is the layer of heresy. This makes it somewhat difficult to map the details of the poem onto the video game, because that is a very, shall we say, political scene, much more so than anything else described by Alighieri. When approaching the city of this from a distance, Dante notes seeing mosques due to Islamic countries being a huge thorn in Christianity's side during the medieval times. The city itself is a dark and twisted parody of the heavenly city on the hill described by Thomas Aquinas, a heavily fortified, cold fort with the river Styx as its moat. He also mentions several people sentenced for heresy by the church relatively recently to his life, when mentioning the heretics burning in tombs in the city itself. But that's all pretty much not relevant to Limbus, as it's rather difficult to transplant these things into interesting concepts for a video game. There are, however, three things going for Limbus portraying that part of the Divine Comedy. First, there's the aesthetics. While a desolate Victorian manor up on a hill is not quite a city in hell, it is still massive, enough so as to be the setting for almost the entire canto, the only one so far without a dedicated dungeon. It is also heavily fortified in a sense, with lightning striking anyone not invited dead on the spot, like poor Sir Squirrel. And of course, there are burning crypts with heretics inside them, or in this version, a basement laboratory filled with rows upon rows of casket-like pods, in which people kidnapped from the streets serve as guinea pigs for experimentation into utilizing the mirror technology. Which leads to the second point in favor, theme. One of the heretics mentioned by Alighieri is Epicurus, a Greek philosopher who landed in a fiery grave rather than in limbo, for claiming that while gods exist, people should not worry too much about them and focus on themselves, and that the soul dies along with the body, so we should focus on living good lives surrounded by friends while we can. They hated him for he was based. The heresy in Limbus is not denying the immortality of a soul, the narrative is literally haunted by two ghosts, but instead it is denying one's individuality. The people in the pods are used as sacrifices to summon endless mirror copies of the inhabitants of Wuthering Heights, no matter how irrelevant they are to their lives. In a world where you can shape your trauma into weapons and armor, denying someone that individuality is the gravest heresy of all. The victims are made into, as it is described by the narrative, pure dough without any characteristics, so they can be reshaped as one sees fit. All of it in search of primordial humanity, the pure essence of what a human being is, ripped away from anything that makes them an actual person. And, as we discussed in the prior video, I highly suspect that if the new league under Herman ever finds what they're searching for, it will be an immaterial nothing, like what Samja dissolves into. Moreover, these experiments are enabled by Wuthering Heights being built atop a nameless river, tethering the spirits of the dead in place, leading to several characters remarking on seeing ghosts. And I think that river is, again, Styx. There are several rivers in the Greek myths regarding the underworld, like Acheron we mentioned when discussing the first canto, and Lethe, which we will talk about in the next canto. Styx is the most famous of these rivers, being the name of a rock band, and it is described as the boundary of Hades, the land of the dead, in works such as the Iliad and Aeneid, and a bunch of modern renditions of the myths as well. Being a boundary between life and death, having these waters flow right beneath the manor, definitely seems like an apt explanation why the souls of the mistresses of Wuthering Heights would linger even after their bodies died. As a bonus point, waters of Styx were used when Greek gods swore oaths to make them unbreakable, which certainly fits the bill of Heathcliff and Katherine stopping at nothing to fulfill their respective promises to commit omnidimensional suicide. Third and last point relating to the Divine Comedy. Entering this requires a divine intervention. The gates are barred by Medusa and the Three Furies, and an angel comes down from heaven to rebuke them and open the gates. For the poem, it is meant as an allegory that the sins within the city are ones that cannot be explained by rational philosophy, like all the previous crimes of passion. In Limbus, we instead have two interventions that break the previously established rules. Vergilius breaking his contract to step in to help us and dispatch the Wild Hunt, and Dante awakening to the powers of Golden Bow Resonance for the first time. Just like an angel in hell, these two events are impossibilities that push us forward. Dante's newfound powers are dubbed Durante, which means to endure, and it was Dante Alighieri's real first name. They follow the steps of the Kabbalistic Tree of Life, but unlike with how it was built backwards in Lobcorp and Ruina, here we follow the correct path from the top down. The topmost node, Keter, is inaccessible due to it being God itself, so instead we unlock Chokmah, or wisdom that comes from nothingness. And as such, the power-up comes out of nowhere, as far as the team is concerned. Though the in-game effect of hoofing it super fast has more to do with the portrayal of the Sephiroth in previous two games in the series than real-life mysticism. Vergilius stepping in to do more than just guide us is a bit more straightforward. He directly invokes his memories from Leviathan, an impossible lab created by the Ring, specifically Asea, to experiment with the mirror technology and one that became a miniature hell on Earth. And how he lost it all and almost distorted when seeing the sword he handed Garnet, his student and one of the orphans he was supposed to take care of, lying on the ground. We get to see his ego in action for the first time in a non-book medium, and some additional teasing, like Ryoshu getting excited at the sight of his Gladius sword, and him saying that family is a blood-drenched ward, which on one hand reflects how much he's lost and how far he's willing to go to protect those dear to him, but on the other hand it carries some incredibly weird implications come next canto. Oh yeah, on the topic of things not from Wuthering Heights, Asea is also here. Based on Yi Hyoseok, one of the founding members of the League of Nine in real life, I kinda don't have much to say about him. The real-life guy's work often explored topics of sexuality, and this guy has been working with the Ring and since Leviathan, using the mirror in gruesome ways for the sake of knowledge. We do get an explanation in-game later on, that lust as a sin is not just about carnal desire, but also the need to multiply ideologically, and molding people into whatever the hell you want certainly fits that. Though it is important to note that in Leviathan, his work was closer to the glass window than a mirror, not making a single reflection of a person in another world, but imposing multiple worlds onto a single point. And we do get every Katherine imposed onto a single person, so that does fit the bill, but the two girl failures also talk to each other using a mirror, so let's just say the barrier between different versions of the glass technology is murky and leave it at that. Though that does give me an idea about the new league led by Herman and why they are so interested in this technology and the bows. What if creating a single world with no mirror reflections would not be due to destroying all the others, but compressing every dimension onto a single reality? I guess we'll see. Alrighty, let's get to the cast of Wuthering Heights and how they were transplanted into Limbus. Josephine is a gender-swapped version of Joseph, the cranky old servant. In a book revolving around extremes of emotions, of love making you endure the worst debasements and hatred casting you into depths of unspeakable depravity, Joseph is just kind of a self-righteous prick that talks down to everyone and as a result nobody really likes him. In the novel, this takes the form of Bible thumping and superstition, seeing the worst in everyone regardless of their intentions and telling them they're demons, witches and whatnot, turning it into a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Though to be perfectly clear, the downward spiral of the novel is not directly caused by Joseph, he's just definitely not helping the situation at all. In the atheism of the city, this is twisted so that Josephine is not quoting scripture at people and telling them they will all burn in hell, but rather into her being haunted by a ghost of the previous mistress of the manor, a beloved authority figure she serves long after that matriarch turned into dust. Which I wish we got some more insight into, honestly. At least some notion of who that mistress was and why she commanded so much respect. As it is, it primes you to view the events within the mansion as a literal haunting, or something similar. Just like Joseph's superstition in the novel infects even the newcomer to the entire situation, Mr. Lockwood, which makes him see the ghost of Katherine Earnshaw trying to enter her old room through the window after he reads her diary. And if that mistress is Miss Earnshaw from the novel, that's just very funny to me, because she appears in one scene to be mad at her husband for bringing Heathcliff into their home, and then dies in a time skip, never to be mentioned again. One other notable trait of the novel Joseph is a thick Yorkshire accent written out phonetically. Bless the heart of anyone playing the role in an audiobook, by the way. And Josephine also speaks with some regional slang included, but it's nowhere near as incomprehensible as in the book. Hindley Earnshaw is the oldest child of the household, and also a terrible lout, but in a much different way. In both the novel and game, he treats Heathcliff as an unwanted eyesore in the house, and in both cases it is in big part due to Heath being favored by Mr. Earnshaw over his own biological son. The novel carries some implication of Heathcliff being a bastard child of the house patriarch. After all, why else would an affluent man go to Liverpool all of a sudden and bring home a child from the streets rather than the gifts he promised for his children? In Limbus, this aspect of Hindley gets dialed up to 11, and he still remembers the violin he was promised and never got decades later. His book counterpart never mentions it again as an adult. And while in the game these feelings of abandonment get turned into class-based aggression, deriding Heathcliff again and again for being an abandoned orphan from the backstreets brought into the home of a Nest family, in the novel it's a bit more, shall we say, racially charged. Novel Heathcliff is dark-skinned, often likened to the Romani or Arabic people, and this poor child hears a lot of slurs from people who are supposed to be his new family. Even when Nellie tries to cheer him up, she says, oh, he might be a child of some Chinese and Indian nobility, underlining how he does not fit in. In the game, these aspects of the narrative are completely omitted, and while I can see the point of people who are disappointed by that, I think this ship sailed back in Ruina with its own diverse cast that at no point caused friction due to bodily differences. We already got robot racism and vampire racism, and making Heathcliff any of this would really fucking stretch his core concept of being a regular-ass guy molded into a sinner by his terrible surroundings. Back to Hindley, in the game he seemingly deteriorates to being a gambling alcoholic all of his own, just getting worse with age and never growing past being a petulant child denied his father's love. In the novel, that shift from a terrible child to an even worse adult has more explainable roots. He is sent away to university and returns as a married man to take over as the owner of the estate when Mr. Earnshaw passes away. His wife, Frances, has a troublesome cough, and as one would expect of mysterious coughing in a romance novel, it kills her, sending Hindley into a spiral of drinking, gambling and violence. His son, Hareton, is hidden whenever he has one of these episodes, and he gets even more venomous towards Heathcliff. How ironic, then, that his object of hatred is the only person to be by his side when he dies. Whether or not Heathcliff had a hand in that final fate is left ambiguous, but he definitely got the poor sod to gamble away his ownership of the heights. And of course, in the game, any ambiguity regarding that gets done away with, and we get a direct confirmation Heathcliff is responsible for both. Well, a Heathcliff certainly is. This is probably a good spot to mention that the author's only brother, Patrick Branwell Bronte, had quite a few issues with death, alcohol and drugs himself, and the severe impact it had on his health caused him to die in September 1848, half a year before Emily. He was a poet, a translator and a painter. In fact, the portrait of Emily Bronte I used at the beginning of this section was made by him, portraying his three sisters and himself, though he painted himself out of it. I did not dig into any sources deeper than Wikipedia, but apparently his more and more erratic behavior caused quite a strain on the family, and it only got worse when he got rejected by a widow that he was in a relationship with when she was still married, mostly because of the aforementioned issues. Keep this in the back of your mind, because I think it illuminates a lot, not just about Hindley, but every man in the novel and their game counterparts. One more thing that I find very interesting about Limbus Hindley is that he is, much to the chagrin of both sides, very similar to Heathcliff in a way, which gets exemplified by both of them distorting in the same chapter into a dog-like form. Both of them are driven into despair by being denied love they desperately crave, and both of them lash out in anger. In the novel, similarly, Heathcliff abuses Hareton much like the boy's father abused him, in a way trying to mold the young Earnshaw into another version of himself, to prove that anyone would become a monster like him in similar circumstances. And yet, Hareton cries tenderly at Heathcliff's funeral at the end of the novel. He may have been a bastard, but he did raise him. Katherine Earnshaw is Hindley's younger sister, and unlike her brother, she quickly learns to enjoy Heathcliff's company. They are both wild children and get into all sorts of trouble together in the marshes surrounding the Wuthering Heights, and she was able to do that because her parents spoiled her rotten to avoid seizures she could get when angered due to a childhood illness. And later Hindley just didn't care when he became the owner of the estate. One of these excursions lands the two kids at Frashwood Grange, a neighboring estate belonging to the Linton family. They are much richer than Earnshaws, proper gentry and all that. Their dog attacks Katherine and they take her in for several weeks, sending Heathcliff away. During that time she grows closer to the son of the family, Edgar, and the Lintons in general insist on giving her a proper education of that era for a young lady, something she never received due to the aforementioned upbringing. 2 years after that incident, she confides in Nellie that she plans to marry Edgar Linton, not because she fancies him, though she's certainly not completely cold on the guy, but because she cannot marry Heathcliff due to his low station in life, wanting to use that money to help him. Too bad Heathcliff only hears a part of that conversation and decides to just leave Wuthering Heights then and there, feeling he has nothing keeping him in there anymore. And when Katherine hears of this, she runs into the marsh to search for him, into a terrible stormy night, only to fail. I like how in Limbus, the sound of thunderclap being equated to her heartbreaking is made explicit. It's neat. In the novel, Heathcliff's grief is portrayed as being haunted by Cathy's spirit, which in the game becomes quite literal. One key difference we need to mention up front is that when Heathcliff returns 3 years later, it's not to a Cathy that is dead, but one that is expecting a child. And his return does not bode well for her mental health, and even as they meet in secret and forgive each other for the hurt they caused, the combination of childbirth and heartbreak causes her death. You know, like in Star Wars. And that is when we get Heathcliff's speech that was recreated in Limbus, begging for Cathy's soul to never know rest so she may haunt him, that she broke her own heart and in breaking it broke his. The return of Heath causing Cathy further heartbreak and torment is shown in Limbus, despite her body being dead, with the 7 thunder strikes. The anguish of her last moments and her haunting him after death in the books are squeezed into one and the same here. Heathcliff also mentioned to Nellie in a delirious state that he had her body dug up years later and she was still immaculately beautiful, untouched by rot. This, in turn, we have portrayed in the form of Limbus Cathy looking like she is sleeping peacefully in her coffin-like science pod, which is definitely less spooky due to less time passing in the universe, but I think the intent is there. Katherine, as she is in Limbus, is a combination of both her literary counterpart and her daughter, also named Katherine, which makes my job writing this very irritating. Cathy too is very similar to her mother, notably having her eyes, but she is much more driven than her mother could ever be due to her health. And a bit sassy at that. Very early into the book, before the whole Nellie recounting of the story to Mr. Lockwood, she snaps back at Joseph, telling him she is indeed a witch and will curse him if he won't shut it. And while in the book this is done as a joke, more so than a genuine threat, I think black magic is a pretty apt description to what Cathy achieves in Limbus, with the connection to all her possible selves in every mirror world. Plus, the memories of her, like her giving riddles and getting mad if Heath got them too early, fits the younger Cathy more, honestly, as she begrudgingly teaches Hareton how to read when they grow closer at the end of the novel. Similarly, her changing her mind about her actions and working against every Katherine in the final fight seems to not be something that Katherine I would do in the book. She maintains her aloof and standoffish persona when Heathcliff comes back up until her death, whereas her daughter does apologize to Hareton and makes her feelings clear. I have to say, I came across many unpleasant words about the book Katherine, especially in relation to her confession to Nellie. Now, she's not the most pleasant person there is in that book, and she definitely wanted to eat her cake and have it still by marrying Linton and still keeping Heathcliff around, but I do have to note that a woman in the 19th century did not have many prospects when it came to social mobility, and I do, on some level, understand how she came to the decision she made. It was a stupid-ass decision, and one that would crash and burn at some point, but it's not like she had many options when it came to getting Heathcliff away from Hindley's abuse. It was that or running away together into the unknown, possibly landing both of them in the streets. So with that said, I do have to say that the same confession doesn't hit nearly as well in Limbus. Like, yeah, getting accolades for her inventions that would make the situation stable would be nice, but that's not nearly as much of a cage as her situation in the novel. She's smart and competent as it is. There are leftist militias scraping by in the nest thanks to their inventiveness one intervallo over. Come on girl, you can manage, I believe in you. What they did transplant perfectly, however, is a part of the confession I did not mention, and that is not done one-to-one in the game. When pushed to say why she cares for Heathcliff so much, Cathy explodes saying, "I am Heathcliff," about how they are both so close that they understand each other perfectly, and that she could not live without him as he is her and she is him. Of course, it quickly turns out that understanding can be easily put into doubt, but the core of that argument remains. The two of them are identical personality-wise. It expresses differently, in the novel as well as the game, largely due to a difference in gender norms and status, but they are both emotional, rash, vindictive, and way in over their heads. And in Limbus, this is portrayed by the mirror Heathcliff and every Katherine having the exact same plan of universe-wide suicide to spare the other one's suffering, to punish themselves for ever causing them pain. Fucking perfect take, no notes. Linton Edgar, the blonde boy next door that married Katherine, is a stitch of two characters in the novel. The first one is obviously Edgar Linton, the guy living in Freshwood Grange that falls in love with Cathy when she stays at that mansion, proposes to her and ends up marrying her when Heathcliff runs away. That part is unchanged in Limbus. He is quiet, reserved, a bit of a classicist prick that joins Hindley in tormenting Heath, and a man that endlessly loves his wife. In Limbus, this takes a much more extreme form, as he willingly bankrolls the Crimes Against Humanity lab under the Heights and dissolves himself into dough to be a vessel to the otherworld Heathcliff, all just because that is what Cathy wanted. In the novel, he is just willing to let Heathcliff visit them because he knows how much that means to his wife, and he dotes on his daughter quite a lot. The other character is Linton Heathcliff, the child of Heath and Edgar's sister, Isabella Linton. Much like Limbus Linton, he is sickly and frail. In the game it seems to just be some hereditary illness. In the novel, his constitution is the result of his mother running away to London through winter when pregnant, just to get the hell away from her husband. It turns out that marrying the dangerous, brooding guy that views you as a tool to hurt the one he actually loves is not the smartest idea. And the moment the vows were said, the mask slipped off and the abuse came in really quickly. I will leave out the details of what is said and implied in the novel. Let me just say that I think this is the only highbrow book where the word slut is used, and you can probably infer who says it. In Limbus, it is Isabella that first sacrificed herself to become the vessel for Earl King Heathcliff, her infatuation with this vortex of anger and bleeding wounds spelling her doom once again. Back to Linton. The son, looking very much like his uncle, returns to the region after his mother's death, and much to the protest of said uncle, he comes to live with his father and is quickly whipped into a tool for revenge. He is powerless, unable to stand up to Heathcliff, and is pressured into marrying Katherine too. And at first he revels in having someone subservient to him, to indulge in cruelty instead of being the victim of it. And the younger Katherine just fucking fixes him through her love, compassion, and a demand for mutual respect and help. He actually helps her escape to visit her father at his deathbed, and pays dearly for it. The Limbus Linton, unfortunately, does not receive such salvation. His love for Cathy is so all-encompassing and toxic that she is to him what Heathcliff was to his son in the novel, an abuser, using him as means to an end. Right up to his death, their love was a way to help Heath like it was originally intended. Just like in the novel, where the child was nothing to his father, but the way to claim ownership of both properties as a fuck you to the love he lost and the man that stole her from him. Ellen Dean, called Nellie by those close to her, is a young servant at the Wuthering Heights. In fact, she is the exact same age as Hindley. She serves as the narrator of much of the story, and as such, your reading of the novel highly depends on what you think of her. For example, Charlotte Bronte, sister of Emily and the author of Jane Eyre, wrote a preface to the second printing of the book after her sister passed away, and in it she says Ellen exemplifies true benevolence and homely fidelity. And let me say, despite the risk of being haunted by the ghost of the writer of one of the biggest pieces of English literary canon that revolutionized prose as we understand it, and having her shriek in horror upon seeing my own shoddy writing, that seems a bit of a shallow reading. Because while Ellen is kind and cordial to Mr. Lockwood that she is telling the tale to, she sure fucking tends to put herself in the best light possible in her story, despite doing things like noticing Heathcliff is right fucking there as Katherine talks about marrying Edgar, or telling Heathcliff to not fuss about being beaten with an iron fireplace poker by Hindley and claim it was a horse that kicked him. Though of course I am not the first person to make this claim. Notably, in a 1958 essay, The Villain in Wuthering Heights, James Hafley brings up all these examples of dissonance between what Nelly says and how it is portrayed. I'll link the full thing in the description, but be aware that it was written in the 50s and the choice of language does reflect that. I have my issues with the essay, namely I think it is much too obsessed with finding a single party at fault for the entire story, even claiming Heath and Kathy are innocent, manipulated through their feelings like Othello by this dastardly maid. I think the truth is much simpler, that despite all her desire to claim otherwise, Ellen is as much of a shit as everyone else in the novel, someone indulging in her worst instincts, namely elitism and being a terrible gossip. Someone who thinks she knows best who deserves what and puts her finger on the scale. But the entire plot was definitely a group effort. Limbus Nelly is much the same way. At first she appears to be genuine and cordial, but by the end of the canto, cracks in her story begin to show. It becomes obvious she knows much more of why there are red-eyed shambling corpses in the manor than she lets on. The novel Nelly tried to set things up to get what she deserved in her opinion, to be part of the household for a better family like the Lintons, and keep that role at any cost. Her game counterpart has a more complex motivation, as she saw infinite possibilities for herself in the mirror, and saw that all of them showed her nothing. No matter what she did, she was doomed to suffer due to Heath and Kathy's petty drama, and she would never be free of it or her ties with the manor. And so, she works to let both of them get exactly what they want, erasing both of them from every possible world, finally granting her freedom. But even when she gets it, she decides to twist the knife one more time, steal the bow and defect to N-Corp, effectively trading one life of servitude for another. I guess she is not unlike her novel inspiration that way, who very happily moved to the Grange when Kathy married. It's not about freedom, despite what she says, but comfort. One particular similarity between both mediums is her burning letters to keep the status quo. In-game, she burns the many letters that Heathcliff sent to Katherine to make her think she was completely abandoned. In the novel, she burns the letters from young Kathy to Linton to avoid having to mention their budding romance to Edgar and potentially jeopardize her own peace and quiet. I think a very interesting choice in Limbus is that Nelly's skin tone is a dark-ish olive, much in contrast to the paleness of Katherine, Hindley or Linton. In the book, she was just a regular British lady after all, so this is a deliberate choice. I think, in a way, it is a signifier of how similar she is to Heathcliff, despite working against him. They are, visually, cut from the same cloth, both different from their rich nest-born families and doing what they can to grab onto a piece of happiness and never let go of it. Though I suppose it can be read in a kinder light as well, as he views her as a good part of his past in the Heights, a confidant and a friend. Both of these things can be true, of course. And finally we have the central figure of this canto, Heathcliff, both of them. In the book, he left to become suddenly rich and worldly in a few short years through unknown means. In the game, he became a member of a syndicate. Due to this, I don't think there is any parallel to Matthew and Dead Rabbits in the novel. After some digging, I found that in one throwaway moment, Mr. Lockwood praises embroidery on a pillow only to realize it portrays Dead Rabbits. Another possible connection is the real-life gang of that name that the movie Gangs of New York was about. Either way, not much to talk about here. The sinner is drawing from both his novel counterpart and Hareton, the son of Hindley that is kept oppressed and uneducated by Heathcliff. Hareton is also brash, prideful and dishonest with his feelings at first, but he is ultimately a kind lad that finds happiness with the second Katherine after she apologizes to him for prior haughtiness and pushing him away. And at the end of the canto, we even have a vision of the two of them looking at the manor in the distance, standing side by side over the graves of their predecessors who could not achieve the same, making it yet another possibility for our British boy, signaling that the chance was there after all. Though I don't think the ring he got from Kathy is from the novel, that's game original, probably to have a physical object that can be referenced by others like the pawnbroker does in Canto II. And in the final stretch of the canto, Heathcliff outright disappears, feeling like he should just not be perceived and that it would be better if he was left alone, as that way he would not hurt anyone else. And this feels pretty akin to Hareton at the beginning of the novel as well. Thankfully, Dante pulls through and doesn't give up on the blockhead. Throughout the story so far, we were able to see both of the inspirations for Heathcliff quite prominently. Much like his namesake, he is violent, vengeful, and driven by the desire to have his revenge against everyone who wronged him. Which is pretty much everyone we described in this chapter so far, even if he doesn't know about Nelly initially. But like Hareton, he is also willing to forgive, wants to see others be better than what he sees in them. The volleyball incident with Ish comes to mind, and is willing to learn to become more than he is. I have to say, I really like the choice of giving him a baseball bat as a weapon of choice, as a pretty clear signifier that he is a rough bloke that uses what he can. Similarly, the bodysack ego is not a direct reference to the novel in any way, but in Mersault's Matt ID Uptide story, we can see that he literally dragged a body in a bag to prove he did the requested hit job. So in a way that represents both his drive to be taken seriously and a desire to bring something back when he returns to the Wuthering Heights, much like his novel counterpart came back a changed man. There is also something to be said about how in Limbus, Heathcliff and Linton are reflections of how their second-generation inspirations turned out. Despite walking the same path and experiencing the same anguish, our sinner refused to turn out the same way as the Earl King, even if he understood him better than anyone else could, much like Hareton. And Linton literally turns into him, showing how in the novel Heathcliff corrupted his own son into a tool for his own needs. The other Heathcliff, however, is inspired by his novel namesake first and foremost. A man on a mad quest of revenge against himself, haunted by Katherine, hurting everyone else in the way. In the novel, Heathcliff as a child is often likened to a demon or other malicious creature in some way. So in Limbus, he is dubbed Earl König or Earl King, the king of elves from a poem by Goethe, about a man riding through a dark forest at night holding his son as the child is tempted by the illusory being into death. And before we go on, I need you to stop this video, open another YouTube tab, and listen to a performance of the poem with Schubert's music. It's 4 minutes, you've got the time, I'll wait. Okay, did you do it? Isn't that the sickest fucking thing ever? And of course, this title fits this Heathcliff, considering he kills everything that comes into contact with him, and he is quite literally an otherworldly force. He rides upon a headless horse, dubbed in-game to be a Dullahan, which is an Irish folk figure of a headless horseman riding a headless horse, sometimes dragging a funeral wagon. So it is a bit of a misnomer to attribute it to just the horse, but what can you do? I suspect someone at Project Moon really likes Durarara, and I can't blame them. Either way, the Dullahan is yet another omen of an upcoming death, so we're 2 for 2 on symbolism here. I do wish we got a version of Heathcliff holding his head in his arms though, that would be metal. Finally, the procession of imperfect, unthinking reflections he leads is dubbed a Wild Hunt, which is a folkloric motif present in Norse and Slav stories, of a host of spirits guided through the night by a leading figure, most commonly Odin or just the devil. Honestly, it's just a dramatization of howling northern winds, but it is pretty rad. And of course it is said to be an omen of an upcoming catastrophe, sometimes even kidnapping people to join their undead parade. You know, like in The Witcher. So, 3 for 3 on symbolism for omens of death. Talk about a one-track mind on this Heathcliff fella. Jokes aside, I do like how despite being driven by a self-destructive rage, he is also sympathetic to our Heathcliff, offering him a quick death. He knows how much it hurts and doesn't take any joy in his mission. Doesn't stop him though. The canto ends with the resonance of the golden bow allowing us to communicate with Kathy, our Kathy, that is a part of every Katherine, and deleting all of them from all words at her request. And even despite that, Dante and Heathcliff remember when no one else does. And Heathcliff truly believes in a miracle to bring her back. We are once again haunted by a vision of someone as dead as one can be in this universe, but in a much more positive context this time. After all, what is a ghost if not a memory? What can we do to honor the dead but remember them? It's also neat that this final confrontation takes place outside, with everyone pelted by the rain. At the start of the novel, Mr. Lockwood sees the ghost of Kathy banging at a window during the storm, telling him to let her in. At the end of it, Heathcliff is found dead in front of an open window, soaked by the rain. In both mediums, the boundary between her spirit and the material world is broken, and Heathcliff dies in the cold tempest. Once again, Demian visits us after the dust settles with a cryptic question from the little prince. This time it's about a rose that he had that was prickly both physically and in words, but smelled beautiful. After leaving his small planet, he came upon a garden full of roses and he wept, realizing he only truly loved that one rose. This time Dante answers this for us and it's pretty direct. What truly matters to you is not the endless possibilities of what can be, but the things and people close to you, in your world. That said, I still don't know what this kid's end goal is. Just being a force pushing us forward like a diamond surely is not the end of it. Oh well, let's move on for now. Still stuck in T-Corp, our motley crew gets dragged into doing dirty work for the time cops, because it turns out changing the flow of time in this particular nest is a bad idea and slaps you in the face with extortionate amounts of taxes. Honestly, I love this Intervallo, but there's not much to be said for the purposes of this video. Seeing the stratification of society that has a time-based economy was neat in a horrifying way. I'm glad to see that Eurodivie are a city-wide force now and Sonia is working to achieve something big, which also serves as a wake-up slap to Rodion, who starts to feel like she's getting left behind despite thinking she's hot shit that will change the world or her life. Relatable! The final boss Distortion, being a leftist commune stuck in a single body that cannot cooperate with itself because everyone in it runs on vibes and did not think of the possibility of running into a fight that would require using up the resources they divided equally amongst themselves, is funny as well. They fell for the all equality without equity, what can I say? The stereotypically Sherlock-esque clothes that the main trio of Ryoshu, Honglu and Rodia don are fun, and of course Don references a detective fixer by the name of Agatha, in a blatant reference to the mystery author Agatha Christie, who wrote such classics of the genre as Murder on the Orient Express, as a totally random example. The most interesting part of this canto is the character of the Incognito T-Corp CEO, Hubert, but I don't know... Oh, sorry, I just got a note. It's Herbert now, because they originally fucked up and it was supposed to be a reference to Herbert George, or more commonly just H.G. Wells, which makes way more sense. Wells was a prolific science fiction author that penned works such as The Time Machine, which certainly fits the T-Corp singularity as far as we understand it, and The War of the Worlds, which I mentioned just because I like it. Based on that prolific biography, Herbert is a chattermouth and a genius inventor that created a bunch of patents for the Nest before even becoming the head honcho of the entire show. Much more interestingly, however, he shares his pacifism with the real-life author, who created a board game Little Wars to give every warmonger a way to air out their needs for carnage without actually hurting people, in a pretty tongue-in-cheek way. This puts Herbert in an interesting light, similar to Stefanette in Canto IV, a bossman that actually wants the work of his company to achieve a net good for society, except for the fact that Stefanette was the original founder of that version of K-Corp and had her work get bastardized after her death, whereas Hubert finds himself in a position of inheriting a shitpile of abuse, repression and economic incentives that reward hoarding and waste despite incredibly obvious inefficiencies, and one that he probably can't radically change without risking assassination at best or an outright wing war at worst, when one of the other corps smells the social upheaval and uses it to their own ends. How British! We also need to discuss the fact that he bulk purchases monoliths from Limbus. What does the company wish to achieve by selling Quico Distortion on an open market? Funding doesn't seem to be a concern thanks to Diaz, as is repeated several times in the game. A very ground-level reading would be the company creating their own customers in the future, as they are projecting an image of an organization that deals with distortions first and foremost. And who better to provide a steady supply of them than companies that think they can achieve something with these artifacts? But as we see in flashbacks in Distortion Detective, it is implied that Diaz wishes to replace the head, and the Smoke War was also a gamble for that goal, breaking a few wings and getting new ones in place that would support her. So maybe the sale of monoliths is nothing more than just simply gathering up potential ignition points and knowing how they will be spread when the time for another move comes. She did mention in that book that learning about and gathering distortions will help her see her dream. It is better to know where the monoliths are rather than have them spread randomly when planning chaos, I suppose. But why would Herbert be interested in purchasing it as well? Maybe he saw some potential after seeing a distortion firsthand. Killing time, after all, was considered to be impossible, and that brain polycule just did it. It might be a gamble as well. After all, maybe one of these distortions will prove helpful and create a way to fix T-Corp in some way. Maybe even a way he could let loose in the Nest and claim no responsibility as it forces some reforms. Who knows? How unexpected, another Agatha Christie reference. Dante and their 12 bastard children board a warp train to speed their arrival to P-Corp for the next canto, as well as to deal with sudden disappearances aboard the train that W-Corp wants to solve on the Hush Hush. Oh no, turns out it's a blood fiend, and that is why they are able to consume people, even despite the stasis in the train that happens when traveling through the other dimension. The sixth kindred is named Cassetti, after the victim in the mystery novel Murder on the Orient Express. You would think that the killer from the story would be a better fit, but spoilers for a book that is almost a century old, and timestamp on the screen to avoid it. 3, 2, 1, go! The twist is that the guy was a piece of shit that kidnapped and murdered a 3-year-old child, and pretty much everyone riding the same coach conspired to kill him to deliver justice. Which is probably why we get a child killed in Limbus as well, sending Dawn into a righteous fury. Of course, we also get the reveal of Dawn being a second kindred herself, giving Dante an uncomfortable amount of foresight when walking into the events of the next canto. And we get a glimpse into how Faust gets disconnected from a network called Gesellschaft, which means society in German, probably implying she's a homunculus from the original story and not Dr. Faust, but I can't really say much before I read the source material. Not much else to discuss here, other than the fact that this short story kinda baffles me in retrospect with how obvious the upcoming fall of W Corp is. Oh yeah, we are running into financial trouble due to loss of cheap energy since Lobotomy Corporation died, but we will also install false safety rooms for our staff that jettisons them and their equipment out into the fucking warp from Warhammer. And nobody knows it's happening, so it doesn't do anything for morale. Silicon Valley company collapse speedrun in the making. I hope we'll get to throw their CEO into their own fun dimension when the war inevitably breaks out later in the story. The Sinners arrive in the nest of P-Corp, where the corporation in charge is organizing an MMO raid against La Mancha Land, at a crapit amusement park from which ravenously hungry bloodfiends crawl out whenever it appears. Clearly, this is Honglu's Canto. As far as the framing of the Divine Comedy goes, this skips over a part where Virgil explains to Dante how everyone in the next three circles deserve damnation the most, explains why moneylending is fucked up, and they get charged by the Minotaur of Crete. We jump straight into the first sub-circle of the seventh layer of hell, punishing those who were violent against their neighbors. In the poem, the likes of Attila the Hun and Alexander the Great, still bullshit that Caesar's not here, tyrants and conquerors are submerged in the river Phlegeton, a current of boiling blood on fire. In Limbus, this rings ironic as the lowercase s sinners here are this universe's take on vampires, and ones that try to suppress their nature and hunger for blood at that. But alas, they failed, and now the roads of the amusement park are flowing with the sanguine juice. The violence was not a choice, but a part of nature that proved inescapable. The Bloodfiends in general seem to have more in common with the Vampire the Masquerade mythos than any literary source like Dracula or Carmilla. Similar to that game line, the Fiends have a single progenitor, called a mother in this case, and each direct descendant of hers is a ruler of a bloodline of their own, a clan if you would. And they seem similarly territorial as it is mentioned in Distortion Detective, there is no more than a single first kindred per district. Though not embracing willy-nilly is considered wise in Masquerade, there isn't a hard 2 descendants per person rule like there is in the city. And of course, the term kindred is shared as an in-group identifier by both game worlds. There is emphasis put on blood as a bloodline, portraying the vampires as a clan, a family. In Limbus, the Bloodfiends are very big on the concept of filial piety, which is to say respecting your elders. It's a core tenet of a lot of Asian philosophies, particularly Confucianism. The love for those of an older generation than you is so intoxicating and ingrained that even thinking of turning against them in the smallest way fills them with revulsion. Pretty similar to how the blood bond is portrayed in VTM, but much stronger and with much less room for someone even entertaining the possibility of rebellion. And I think the different cultural lens of the two works is the key distinction here. The Bloodfiends also have a very strong revulsion against running water, which is part and parcel for vampire mythos, because hydrophobia is what people infected with rabies have, and that was at least partially a source of these fairy tales. But I find it interesting that after 2 games and 1 book that feature these creatures in some way, there is not a single mention of the sun being an anathema to them, which is like the most stereotypical weakness for vampires usually. I don't have a point to make here, I just find it fascinating. While on the topic of Bloodfiends, I would be remiss to not say that Moses runs into a pretty cordial first kindred in the ruins of the Nest L in Distortion Detective, and she mentions that to our sinners in this canto. Said elder, named Lariette, even feeds on people without killing them, though she does need a room full of guys to take a bit from each to accomplish that. But it kinda shows that La Mancha Land was not doomed from the start, and maybe could have accomplished what it set out to do, but the Hemobars were just that fucking garbage. Also, it's very interesting that these creatures can be centuries old, but feel kinda like a distortion to Moses and Dante, and that there are new Bloodfiends that pop up as a result of distorting. Maybe, just maybe, this is not the first time this shit actually happened. Maybe the sickness of the soul in LobCorp was an overcorrection to a world that was overrun by monsters born from emotions, and we did not witness a breakthrough in how the world operates, but just yet another revolution, a spin of an ever-continuing cycle. Nobody in the city keeps good historical records after all, and the duology of LobCorp and Ruina were all about a cycle. Who's to say that it was not just a tiny wheel within an even bigger wheel? Getting to the core literary inspirations here, there are in fact two of them. There is obviously the ingenious gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra from 1605, a two-volume novel about a middle-aged nobleman that read too many books about chivalric knights-errant and decided to become one himself, despite the fact that the world has no giants to slay and kingdoms to claim. It is important to note that these books were, in Cervantes' time, kinda what the isekai anime is for us today. By and large, power fantasy slop, where one noble arm falls armies of enemies. But there is definitely some reluctant love for gems of that literature shining through the book, and Cervantes is not shy about flexing just how much he has read. At one point, the novel name-drops Orlando Furioso by Ludovico Ariosto, and Don Quixote ponders if he should lose his mind to passion like Roland did, completely oblivious to the fact that he already did. I immediately understood why fixers were likened to knights in Limbus Dawn's eyes, and it made for a very funny moment of realization. Thank you for my education in classics of literature, indie game studio from South Korea. The second inspiration is Men of La Mancha, a 1965 musical by Dale Wasserman, or more likely its 1972 movie adaptation directed by Arthur Hiller. Men of La Mancha is not a direct adaptation of Don Quixote, but rather a story inspired by it. A tale told on many levels, as we watch Miguel de Cervantes in jail put on a play of Don Quixote, a story still in the process of being written in universe, for other prisoners. Masks, costumes, props and stage dressing all are drawn attention to, as well as the color commentary from the inmates who are both actors and audience. Which of course fits perfectly into how the events of Don Quixote's life are presented to us in the Canto, as a play describing both events of the past and what is to come in the present, with the sinners being both actors and audience. And of course, Samson is as much of an inmate as everyone else in La Mancha land, as he is also a blood fiend, a prisoner to the craving for blood that spelled the doom of everyone involved in the story. Though the novel is definitely no stranger to metafictional elements as well, with the book being written as a translation of historical records written in Arabic, and the second volume containing characters that read the first tome and are already aware of Don Quixote's misadventures, which in itself plays into the sinners viewing a fictionalized version of real events from Don's life in the plays and fighting against people that knew her in the previous life, not to mention traveling through the ruins of a dream that was La Mancha land. Don Quixote is a long-ass book, and Limbus in no way tried to do a direct adaptation of it, but rather took the core ideas of it and made its own thing from them with nods here and there. For example, the chapter names in Limbus are formatted pretty much exactly like the chapter names in the novel, which is neat. The helm of Mambrino in the source is just a delusion of our gallant knight of woeful countenance, a supernatural meaning superimposed onto a basin that a barber was wearing on his head when riding around on a donkey. Whereas in a fantastical story with quasi-magical technology, it actually is a potent artifact. Fun fact, that artifact is also mentioned in Orlando Innamorato and Orlando Furioso, so there's a tangential connection to previous games. I do appreciate them giving us that Quixote falling for several scams in the flashbacks, just to show the helm was an exception to the rule. And I'm incredibly disappointed to say, there is no bear in either the book or the musical. Oh yeah, and I'm not gonna discuss Shichun in any way, because I haven't even touched Dream of a Red Chamber yet. With those small things out of the way, let's get to the juicier stuff. The fixer chucklefucks like Camille, who are going into La Mancha land for fame and profit, are the game's version of harsh reality as compared to the lofty chivalric ideals that Don Quixote espouses. In the novel, the world was contemporary to Cervantes, so Don Quixote lives in a world that, over a century prior, invented the printing press, and so Europeans learn that there is another continent if you go really far west. There are no knights in that world, let alone ones of Arthurian legends or the 12 peers of Charlemagne. In Limbus, the fixers are definitely around and still doing things, but they are not like they are portrayed in tales of old and, let's be real here, their own recruitment propaganda. They are highly trained, well-equipped thugs, with any decorum being a product of specialization, group identity, marketing, and plain old vainglory rather than a symbol of any class or honor. Which is also pretty on point for how any aristocratic warrior class has been in real life, once you go past the codes of how they should be and read into the historic records of how they actually were. The idea that the violence you dole out is righteous will fuck your moral compass up, I tell you what. And probably the best mirror of it are the Bloodfiend hunters, fixers specializing in hunting just that aberrant form of humanity, which, like in all vampire media, skirts the line between a necessity, because a lot of them pose genuine risk, and fantasy racism, because the ones that are easier to hunt down are almost no risk at all. Also, their leader Romero is probably a reference to George Romero, the director of Night of the Living Dead. Or John Romero, the guy who kills the final boss of Doom 2. Horror adjacent name either way. To avoid tying myself up into knots, let's address our third sinner, Don Quixote, first. That's not even her real name, she's Sancho that deluded herself into being Don Quixote, which is actually the name of her Bloodfiend elder. As such, I will refer to her as Sancho for the purposes of this chapter, even despite the fact that Sancho with her full memories, under the delusion of being Don, and at the end, when she knowingly plays the part of the knight, are three very different personalities. Sancho Panza in the novel and musical is a simple farmer that followed Don Quixote on his donkey Dapple, serving as his squire. In both renditions, he is a grounded man full of proverbs, that somewhat foolishly trusts Don at his word for things he has no idea about, like enchanters and magical artifacts, but will not budge when he's looking at something that is clearly one thing, but his lord claims it's something completely else. Like a windmill being a giant, for example. The key difference is that many adaptations make Sancho a lovable simpleton. In Men of La Mancha, he even follows Don just because he likes him. Whereas the original rendition of the character is a kind-hearted, but deeply cynical and greedy peasant that initially only goes along with the delusions of Alonso Quijano, the noble from his village that read too many books, because the man said that squires tend to get rewarded with riches and positions of governance for their service. And I love that the Limbus went with the latter, making Sancho in her Bloodfiend days just full of sarcasm and exasperation. But just like the musical version of the Squire, she has genuine love for Don Quixote as her hero, someone that saved her and gave her something she never had before, a family, a future, the chance to look forward to tomorrow. It is quite interesting how our Sancho is against siring more Bloodfiends, perfectly content with forever being a child following in the footsteps of Don Quixote, whereas in all other versions the simple squire is a husband and a father. Just like in the novel, Sancho gets swept up in the tales of chivalry despite seemingly knowing better. In the book, he follows the foolish knight to the end, even as he swears to not adventure anymore for a year and dies of an illness. In the game, she soaks in the stories from Barry like a sponge. Don Quixote himself is, in all renditions, a complex character. In the novel, he is in equal parts a violent menace, a larper, and someone with surprising clarity on any matter that does not relate to him personally, and truly speaking about them, unknowingly making full use of his jester's privilege. In the musical, he is an old man who got broken by how horrible the world is and decided to view reality not for what it is, but what it should be, striving to fulfill that dream of chivalry, no matter how impossible it is. And in Limbus, again, we get a bit of both. Don, as a delusion of our sinner, is an unknowing pretender, someone who vibrates in place at the mere prospect of meeting a prolific fixer, who rushes headlong into danger that lands the party in a whole ocean of trouble, but who also slowly garners their fondness for doing the things they want without stopping herself to think about the consequences, cutting through the bullshit. Meanwhile, the real Don Quixote is a Bloodfiend so distraught by the isolation brought about by his nature that he fights against his own kind to protect humanity, and later creates a place where the two groups can coexist in peace and joy, an amusement park. And in between the war and the dreamland, a man so desperate for a hobby, for any semblance of a goal to strive towards, that he picks up several activities like knitting before abandoning them rather quickly. He staked everything on this impossible dream, the miracle of suppressing his and his kin's instincts to blend back in with the people they once were, only for that dream to crash and burn. Similarly to the knight-errant in Men of La Mancha, who saved a woman from sexual assault only to tell her it's noble to dress the wounds of your enemies, which led her to being left alone with them with unfortunately predictable results, Limbus Don is too trusting in the better nature of others, leading to his downfall. And in this case, it's by the hands of his own progeny. In all three versions of the story, we end with Don Quixote's death, but there is a very important difference in tone. In the novel, he is bested and swears an oath to give up adventuring for a year, and as he returns home he falls deathly ill, regains his senses on his deathbed, and despite Sancho doing everything he can to spark that sense of adventure once more, includes in his will that he does not want his niece, the inheritor of his remaining wealth, to marry a man that reads books of chivalry. It is a moment of despair, awakening to a reality after a long mirage, and that crushing reality does what no amount of blows could. Because let me tell you, Don Quixote gets the shit kicked out of him in the novel a lot, and he keeps getting up like the Undertaker. Though this sudden ending may have just been a way for Cervantes to take care of his matters. There were 10 years in between both volumes, and it is very likely that the second volume would not exist if not for the unauthorized sequel penned by one Alonso Fernandez de Avellaneda, nowadays commonly referred to as Fake Quixote. I have to admit that I have not read it, but it is directly referenced and mocked in the second volume of the True Adventures. They pretty much start because Don Quixote can't believe the shit he's hearing about himself. And of course, this does tie into our tale of two Quixotes in the game quite neatly. Looping back to how the death is portrayed by the novel, it is very similar in tone to what ends La Mancha Land. Reality catches up with the dream and leaves Don Quixote in despair, bound to a single place and realizing he hurt those close to him with his actions. Though in the game he's staked to a Ferris wheel rather than just stuck in bed. And the same despair also touches Sancho when she regains her memories, returns to her senses in a way. In Men of La Mancha, the ending is at first similar, but the pleas of Sancho and Aldonza, we'll get to her, actually succeed in bringing Don back, and he gets right back up, ready for another adventure, and dies not in despair, but with a song on his lips. He still dies then and there, but, happy. And his life and deeds inspire others, both within the story and in its metatextual layer, as the Song of Impossible Dream is chanted by the prisoners watching Cervantes get taken by the Inquisition to an unknown end. And this is reflected in the final boss fight of Limbus, as the final clash with Sancho brings back those ridiculously juvenile words and dreams, and our sinner once again carries the name after mourning her father, swearing to chase that star, no matter how far. In general, it is quite interesting how this canto focuses on the dream of abandoning your nature, with the Bloodfiends treating their condition as a sickness that they can never heal. The novel is largely comedic in tone, but there are bits of it that discuss the topics of destiny, truth and fiction. Do these tales of chivalric ideals count as nothing but droll that distract one from reality by the very principle of their nature, or do they hold value as portrayals of idealized people that let us have an image of what we should strive towards? Is one bound to a given lot in life by birth? Or can someone like Sancho be given a fake government role as a joke, and end up doing such a good job that his laws remain in place for centuries to come? How does the tale of Don Quixote differ from other tales of fiction that characters tell each other in universe? And going back to Limbus, is that dream truly impossible, or can one's nature be defeated and let someone who needs violence to survive become a truly noble person? It's also very interesting that this comes right after Canto VI, as your view of the impact of nature and nurture on a person's moral fiber is gonna paint your view of Wuthering Heights, which is why the discussion of characters such as Nelly and Heathcliff have been raging for a century and will continue doing so until the heat death of the universe. In Canto VII, we have an undisputable nature leading to violence against other people, a literal thirst for blood that overrides even laws of physics like the time dilation inside the warp train. And the game, it seems, tries to say that even such an overpowering force can be withstood and defeated by a dream and a found family of 12 lovable fuck-ups. The Durante power we unlock in this chapter now follows the Kabbalistic node of Bina, the node of knowledge and understanding. Dante lights a clear path for Sancho to follow, gives her the means to strive to a goal that should be impossible, and it takes the form of free ego stuff because everyone's favorite goth cop produces your ego gear in Lobotomy Corporation. The three key Bloodfiend characters, the priest, the barber and the princess Dulcinea, are based on the characters in the novel, but somewhat tangentially. A priest, a local barber, and Don Quixote's niece burn most of his books on chivalric ideals when he returns from his first sally beaten black and blue, and then blame it on an evil wizard spiriting the texts away, which seems like a pretty one-to-one connection to the notion of destroying a dream and betrayal. The Bloodfiend priest easily is the most conflicted about the backstabbing, which is probably because the man of the cloth in the book primarily wanted to heal Don and make sure he's alright, rather than having any self-serving motive. The barber in the tale is a typical side character, so honestly not much to say here, other than that I'm glad they got her a job of stitching the carnival masks to the faces of people, because it's a very fun representation of how devoured by guilt they all are, trying to keep the macabre amusement park going even after it long lost its intended purpose, becoming a dark parody of itself. In a way, their continuation of La Mancha Land is a broken, impossible dream in itself. After all, they wanted to be true to their nature of desiring blood, which led them to act against their nature of filial piety. No matter which moral framing you perceive them through, they are sinners. Dulcinea is an interesting case because despite being an important name and therefore becoming a second kindred in Limbus, she's kinda not a character in the original novel. She is a title given to a pretty village girl that Don Quixote never spoke with, an ideal of someone to serve more so than an actual person. The knight and Sancho do actually meet the village girl in the second volume, and she does such a cool flip over a donkey that Don gets distraught that a fair lady got enchanted and turned into a common working girl. In the musical, the same delusion gets thrust upon Aldonza, a prostitute working in an inn, who at first rejects the idea, angry for not being seen as she truly is. But by the end, she takes the name Dulcinea in sincerity, daring to hope for a better reality than the one she finds herself in. Slight aside, but I do find it wild that a book from 400 years ago is more feminist than a modern movie, as this Dulcinea is defined by her relationship with men, and another man gives her hope for something else. Whereas in the novel there are several plotlines where women take an active role in shaping their lives, including one that just tells a couple of guys pining after her that they're jerks for blaming her for their attraction. Alright, obligatory woke critique segment over. Dulcinea as a blood fiend is therefore a bit weird. She embodies her role fully, continuing on the parade she was the head of when La Mancha Land was normal, for a given sense of that word, still being the perfect beauty she was meant to be for the performance. She also seems bitter about that role, feeling like Sancho was the favored child of their father. She's just resentment personified, for having pretty much her entire life imposed onto her. She is best understood as a character when contrasted with her sister. Dulcinea played the part of a fantasy perfectly, fulfilled every bit of the fiction woven by their father. But it was the abrasive, sarcastic Sancho who got all the love and companionship as a traveling partner, despite undermining the fantasy with every word. But of course it could never turn out differently. Fantasy thrives when opposing reality, imagining what could be rather than what already is. If there is no friction, there is no need to dream of tomorrow rather than just being content with today. What else is there? Rocinante is indeed a horse in the source material, but he is an old workhorse and not a combat steed despite the words of the one riding on top of the animal. Here it's a blood golem thingy masquerading as a pair of Air Jordans. In Limbus, the steed is symbolic of the dream in itself, as it both suppresses Sancho's bloodfiend instincts and powers, and the notion of waking up to reality is likened to falling off a horse. And of course, the dream that accomplishes nothing is likened to a plastic horse on a merry-go-round, spinning in circles. Sancho regaining her memories by the end of the canto transforms this empty escapism into a true dream, a goal she strives to despite knowing her limitations and the danger involved. There are two abnormalities we fight in this Cantos dungeon. Hurting Teddy Bear is a pretty straightforward representation of the loneliness of Don Quixote, both before creating La Mancha Land and now, after being staked by his family and left hidden behind doors and chains. And the Rose Hunter is based on the hunter sent to chase after Snow White in that tale, searching for an apple that will become a princess, not knowing its rightful place, making it in a way a personification of the reality chasing after a dream of La Mancha Land to squash it for daring to defy logic of what bloodfiends are. Finally, there is a character cleaved in two by the Limbus adaptation. In the novel, bachelor Sanson Carrasco is a friend of Alonso Quijano that wishes to end his delusions, not by telling him to confront reality, as that really doesn't work for others thus far, but rather by indulging in the fantasy and breaking it from the inside. He approaches Don Quixote two times, once under the guise of the Knight of Mirrors, and once as Knight of the White Moon. And in this second confrontation, Sanson is victorious, demands that Don Quixote gives up adventuring for a year, and, well, we already discussed how that ends. In the musical, he is much more of a dick, a man betrothed to Don's niece that does not want to have a madman for an uncle, and he succeeds as the Knight of Mirrors, with the same end result. In Limbus, Sanson and the Knight of the White Moon are two separate entities. The knight, named Bari, is based on the Korean fairy tale of Princess Bari, a seventh daughter of a cursed king, abandoned by her parents and pitied by the gods who take her in. She is a compassionate soul that feels sorry for the father who abandoned her when hearing he became deathly ill, labors for 9 years in the underworld to obtain life-giving water, and brings her father back to life with it. In return for her heroic deed, she asks to become a deity to console the souls of the poor dead she encountered in her travels through the afterlife. She is pretty much a figure of an ideal person, humble and kind, a compassionate god. Bari in Limbus seems to be a similarly all-loving person, a fixer that actually embodies the knightly ideal of the profession, someone willing to spar with a potentially dangerous bloodfiend elder for days on end to give him a hope for tomorrow, a true dream to strive towards, to have him break out of the self-imposed isolation that cost him nothing but boredom and despair. And she's probably immortal too, considering we can see her in one of the bad endings of Ruina, which takes place at least 200 years after her first meeting with the La Mancha family. Deeply fascinating gal, I hope we get to meet her again. It's also very interesting that she guides Sancho through the ruins underneath the city to Lethe, the River of Oblivion from Greek myth, yet another body of water flowing through Hades. Just like in Limbus, the mythological river brings absolute erasure of memory, and in some accounts it was thought that drinking from it was a requirement before reincarnating or truly passing on, to not bring old baggage with you into a new life. In a way, this is what kills Sancho and gives birth to the Don Quixote we know from the game up until this point. Are the ruins based on the Greek myth of afterlife? Probably in part. I bet there's way more shit down there. The city's history is definitely much longer than just 900 years. Though I do need to mention that the river Lethe is also mentioned in the Divine Comedy, located atop Mount Purgatory. So I'm guessing we'll be going there at that point in the game, at the very latest. I have no idea why, of all places, Sancho gets locked up by Barry in a lighthouse in the ruins to keep her safe. I mean, I do get it on a plot level, I just don't think it relates to the source material in any way. However, it is very interesting that when Virgilius digs her out, he flashes his red eyes at her. These are not prosthetics, but indeed transplants from a bloodfiend, a friend of his, a first kindred. Leviathan mentions his life before his eyes were filled with blood, and while it sounds like a metaphor, nope, that's why the bloodfiend eyes are red. The web novel also mentions Verg and that friend of his shared some dream of a future for the city, but it was buried in his soul, likely by the death of that friend that is now coloring the way he looks at the world. We never learn of what dream it was, but it is very likely that Elder was a dreamer similar to Don Quixote, maybe on an even bigger scale. Family truly is a blood-drenched word for this poor guy. Samson in Limbus is much closer to his namesake, being someone related to Sancho as a fellow bloodfiend, trying to make her see reality, which is to say regain her memories, by indulging in the fantasy in the form of the theatrical play of her life as Don Quixote. And I guess he got real Don Quixote stabbed with the bow to make his memories resonate with Sancho's heart, in a way doing the same thing as we've seen in Canto 1 and 4, but this time there is an obvious veneer of theatrical fakeness to it, because these are not our sinner's memories after all, just a recreation of what she thinks happened. In the post-canto finale, we also get confirmation that he works with Demian and views himself as kind of a lighthouse keeper, shining from afar like a star to guide others and warn them of danger. Implicitly, us being those others. The blue fellas definitely want us collecting bows, but to what end? What was supposed to be the warning here? Assuming they achieved their goal this time around, it may be Sancho waking up and continuing the dream regardless, showing that delusion makes the inevitable crash against reality much more painful than it needs to be. That this perilous world can be challenged head-on while looking at it, not averting your gaze. This is pretty much the difference between distorting and manifesting ego, so it seems appropriate. As a conclusion for this part of the tour, let's take a look at the best scene of the canto. All sinners coming together to recall the tales of the adventures they had so far. Not a fictional account of heroic deeds, not propaganda of fixers, but actual events that happened to them. How they faced danger together, bonded with each other, how the time they spent in Don Quixote's company made them appreciate her as a person on different levels. Reality may be horrible, but we're having fun despite that, as long as we're in this shit together. That truth is more interesting, more intimate, more motivating and uplifting than a story that has no relation to you. If you are reaching for an unreachable star, it's important to know for sure your hand is extending toward it and not a lighthouse sitting atop perilous rocks. And during this, the mark of Cain briefly shows on a certain forehead, because that star can be reached, reality can be altered, distance be damned. The hand of the clock moves forward, the end grows closer. How long was the dream of the Red Chamber again? Oh no. And that's gonna be it for this part. Thank you for your patience. This should have been out in 2025, but winter depression got my ass early this time. We should be getting to new material in March. The thumbnail for this video was once again made by Erix03. Massive thanks to my Patreon supporters, now visible on the screen, especially the new souls in the fold, Akira and Eckenstein. I'm off to play Pathologic 3. See ya!